Okay, so perfect. So what are we gonna do today? As the title suggests, we're gonna be speaking about what culture debt is and what is like the difference with technical debt. Because of the nature of culture debt, this is usually invisible, and the cost just like started growing till is in a moment just impossible to manage. But so because of that, today we're going to be trying to understand what the culture debt is. And we're going to see this through three different lenses, culture and leadership, culture and operations, and culture and people data. But to start with this, we need to know what, oh, okay. To have this conversation, we're going to be speaking to these wonderful panelists, James, Oyin, and Rachel. So just to introduce you all, a brief, a brief about you. So James is an operation, culture, and leadership consultant, helping mission-driven startups and scaling organizations build clearer, more human, and more resilient systems and ways of working. Oyin Williams is the lead product designer at the Honeycomb Works. She helped build Corto Plus in partnership with the Royal Academy of Engineering. And through conversations with dozens of funders and leaders in the engineering space, she has seen firsthand the value of prioritizing good cultures in high stakes environment. And last but not least, Rachel is a leadership coach who works with women who own or run a small or growing organizations. She works with her clients to create the culture and communication structures needed for building sustainable, high-performing teams, bringing nearly 20 years of experience building and scaling teams across sectors. So thank you all for joining us here. And we're very excited about like having this conversation with you all. So as I mentioned, to begin with, we need to know what we understand with culture debt. And here we're going to say that culture debt is this accumulated cost of building an organization without deliberately designing the people infrastructure. Similar as technical debt, it comes from shortcuts, informal practices, undocumented processes, decisions deferred that feel manageable in the moment, but compound over time. Having this definition in mind, I want to ask Rachel, what is the cost of this culture debt that we're talking about?
Yeah, thank you. Well, unlike technical debt, which tends to announce itself in really clear ways with, delays, failing tests, big incidents and things like that. Culture debt, like you said, tends to kind of accumulate more slowly and subtly and often looks like everything is fine until it very much is not. And there are two reasons that it can stay hidden for so long. The first is passive invisibility. So founders don't build their culture neutrally. They build it within their own image, their own rhythms and communication preferences, things like that. Conway's law is this idea originally from software architecture, but it really applies just as cleanly to people infrastructure as well, which is essentially without intentional design, your culture won't emerge organically. It will be inherited from you. And inheritance without intention behind it is how the debt starts accumulating before you even realize what's happening. Some concrete ways this might show up would be unclear promotion pathways, different communication structures for different people, creating roles for someone specific, things like that. And then the second is active invisibility. And this is more of what people think of because this is where the symptoms are very visible, but people don't connect them back to the root cause. Um, and an example of this is about 10 years ago, Volkswagen learned this in a really hard way to the tune of $33 billion in what's now known as Dieselgate, where essentially they were lying about their emissions testing on some of their vehicles in the US. And that cost them this money in fines and settlements and buyback costs. And it wasn't actually a technical problem. It wasn't an engineering problem. It was due to a culture that had just completely normalized bad judgment at every level. And if you want to know more about how they then turned it around, a paper that we wrote as the Culture Collab talks in more depth about how Volkswagen then rebounded from Dieselgate.
Thank you, Rachel. I think that's slightly shocking to know that that's something like both like some organization at Volkswagen like have that problem. But this happened like 10 years ago. Where do you see some examples of this culture that today?
Yeah. So um, I would actually argue that the tech world's appetite for the 996 work week and the sometimes poorly considered approach to AI adoption are actually actively accruing culture debt today. And they share the same underlying logic, which is basically extract more, invest less, and call it efficiency. Um, and so, like with this idea of 996 working just, all the time, um, not only does it demand too much of of employees, but it also normalizes that demand. And when you make exhausting output the baseline, then you are no longer building a high performance team. You're building a compliance team. And people are going to stop raising concerns um, because that looks like weakness. They stop setting boundaries because that looks like not being committed or not performing. And so these expectations just build your cultural debt along the way. And it comes in the form of burnout and attrition and can really hurt your leadership pipeline because the people who are feeling the most aware are going to leave first. And I think what makes this like really important right now is that this is happening alongside a growing public literacy around burnout. So people know what burnout looks like, they know what it costs them, and you have organizations who are pushing this overwhelming, pressure sitting alongside a workforce that has the language and the willingness to name what's happening and to demand something different. And similarly, when it comes to AI adoption, uh, you know, a lot of work in using AI to sidestep headcount decisions and framing it as innovation. But they're building more resentful teams instead of leaner ones. And there's a real disconnect between what leadership is saying they are doing or saying they want and what teams are actually able to do. And so you're getting a performance gap that no one is going to be allowed to talk about. And on top of that, they have the added burden or nervousness and anxiety around, what AI is going to mean in terms of redundancies and layoffs. So it's we talk about it like it's transformation, but if we're not doing it thoughtfully, then we're really just creating culture debt and creating a crisis for down the road. Um, and I think these things that I bring up sort of sound like they're about enterprise-sized companies, but what about startups and small businesses? The fact of the matter is, like, no business is immune from these risks. And the impacts can be really huge. On the subtler end, sort of the beginning of the spectrum, you have clicks and miscommunication and ambiguity, but those then turn into, like friction when investors are asking questions about your retention and your team stability, or legal exposure when, the culture that you built doesn't actually like a lot, produces behavior that you can't defend. And so it might start feeling like it isn't a dramatic cost, but as it compounds, it can really become cripplingly expensive.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's very interesting. And I think that going in depth with this concept and like the concept of culture there and its costs, I resonate a lot with this kind of like warning that it is a risk at all level. Like there's no immunity for being a startup or a small business, or like having this culture debt. What do you think about Rachel just said, like Oyin and James?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because from speaking to a lot of founders and leaders in the engineering industry, particularly startups and scale-ups, we've seen that same pattern around, for example, with startups, usually there's a founding team that, set the tone or set the culture from the start. And when there are no processes in place to actually create that structure, create that culture that is more considered, you find out that that kind of trickles down, and those bad habits just kind of become cracks, that turn to something else, which is the culture debt as time goes on. So I think, yes, it may feel like it's an enterprise problem, like Rachel said, but really it's something that shows up, and it's something that really you need to start thinking about even at the early stage when you're just building your company.
Yeah, agreed. What about you, James? What would you say about this?
Uh, I really resonate. I mean, a lot with what Rachel says, and I think for me, it really comes down to intentionality, and I think it's really about what are we all have this vision in mind about the technical side of the company, and there's milestones and roadmaps about that. But typically, when it comes to people, infrastructure, and the culture, I'm not saying all the time, but often, that's not something that's given a lot of thought. And this is kind of why we're talking about this. That's where that debt is accruing, because ultimately reaching that vision from a technical perspective means you need to have a culture that gets you there. And if you don't design that, then that's actually going to be one of the things that makes it quite difficult. And it's hard to see that and know that early on.
Yeah, and actually that's exactly what I would like to ask you. Like, if it has to be kind of intentional, why do you think organizations don't see it till it is too late?
So I think the reason that culture stays invisible for so long is that it's almost never shows up wearing its own name, right? So it borrows other people's name, and by the time you've worked out what you're dealing with, you're already paying for it. So for instance, Rachel talked about the leadership gap and, the founder's clarity and how that translates into the team's experience. That gap exists and it tends to show up as confusion or inconsistency or mixed signals. And the founders often read that as a team problem rather than a communication problem. So the same principles apply here from the operations perspective as well. So it's just hiding in a different place. And for me, that's the operations gap. And, the operations gap is basically what I see often misread consistently in the work that I do, because it doesn't feel like a culture problem. It often feels like a people problem, a communication problem, or a hiring mistake, or a management issue, or something like that. But more often than not, it's an operations problem. And so when we talk about it being an operations problem, what do we mean by that? It's talking about the systems and the structures that were never formally built. It's talking about the processes that live in people's heads, which is fine when you're a small team. It's talking about onboarding, which is, oh, follow this person around for 2 weeks and you're going to get everything that you need to know. And they don't have it written down anywhere either. So you're just passing on things. And I've worked, my background is in tech and biotech. That doesn't work. Like trying to bring an OCP from someone's head into someone else's head just never works. And also importantly, it looks like nobody quite knowing who owns what decision. So you're kind of thinking, oh, okay, well, what am I doing with that? So all of it ends up flowing back up to the founder. So the team has grown, but the infrastructure is still sized for the team that it used to be. Uh, which is quite a challenge. And I think that really builds onto something that Rachel touched upon. And when she mentioned Conway's Law, and we also talked about it in the first article that we wrote about, the expensive infrastructure decision that founders often leave to chance. And I think the core part of that article and Rachel's point is that without intentional design, an organization doesn't build something new, it replicates whatever communication structure that already exists. So within a startup, what that means is that the culture and the operations don't emerge from a plan. They're actually directly inherited from the founder's habits, whatever blind spots they may have, and whatever default rhythms have, been started with. And often you can't see it from the inside because it just feels like, oh, that's how things are done here. So ultimately, it means, an operations culture, an operations problem is also a culture problem. So if you think about it, if you never designed how decisions get made, who owns what, or how people are onboarded, it's not that you didn't actually avoid building the processes or the culture or the systems. It's more that you built them by default. And that default is the process and the culture that is inherited from the founder or the early team, and that's typically held together with informal agreements, with, side by side conversations, which again, in a team of four makes a lot of sense. But then when you start to scale, that's when the culture debt starts to compound. And I think it's particularly hard to catch with timing. So like I said, at 5 people, 4 people, it's fine. It's invisible and doesn't really matter. Everyone knows everything. The decisions happen in conversation and it works. But when we are at 50 people, or even to be honest, 15 people, the same informal structures have become the load-bearing walls and the workaround has become the process. So actually you have cemented something by mistake. And we also talked about this in the article. And one of the things we brought up was Barron and Hannon's research about Silicon Valley startups, which, they did research that showed that those that tried to change their fundamental people and culture models midway through their journey saw a sharp decline in their actual success outcomes. So it's not that change is impossible. It's just that by the time you're doing it, you're having to rebuild the infrastructure while the building is being occupied. So you actually end up paying for it twice. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And I think coming back to your point earlier about, this visibility side of things, even when leaders decide to look, they commission a survey, they do a culture audit, or they try to take stock, their ability to get accurate information is in itself shaped by the infrastructure that they've built. So the same absence of structure and design that creates the operations gap also creates the conditions where honest information just can't flow. So you don't get to understand exactly what is happening within your organization because there's no psychological safety built in, there's no feedback structure, there's no design conditions for honest conversations and truth telling to happen. So the operations gap doesn't just cost you in terms of the systems, it also costs you in terms of the visibility. So you can't see what's broken because the thing that's broken is also the thing that you're using to look at. So, for instance, if your feedback culture is as informal as the decision-making processes and culture that you have, the thing that comes back to you when you're asking for this information is actually not a clear picture. It's one that's actually distorted. So typically organizations can't see their culture debt because they're often the ones that need to actually build those conditions for honest culture data and honest feelings of what's happening to surface in the first place.
Yeah, that's great and super important. Thank you for that, James. I think that at the Honeycomb we said like we see a lot that is like some of them things that like the processes, the culture is something kind of like granted, and as you mentioned, it start becoming a problem when you start scaling. But also, it's kind of like you have to be intentional from the beginning of like the processes and the system you're building. Um, and based on that, like of course, I would like to know like what Rachel and Ayin are thinking about this. You're mute, Rachel.
Hi, it's only been, 6 years since we've been living on Zoom. Yeah, I think that uh, the phrase that James used that really sticks out for me and that I think really sums it up is an operations problem is a culture problem. And I think often people think of them as, like my operations and my culture are two distinctly separate things, but they're not. And you have to understand the connection between the two if you want to be able to make sure that you're actually limiting your culture debt and that you're building an organization that is scalable and sustainable.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the things that really struck me about what James talked about is just like there is just like this loop that keeps going on. So it's like you don't create that when you don't create that space to be able to collect honest data, it kind of feeds into that, that kind of culture, and that also feeds into, more issues. So it's really important to look at the conditions under which you're collecting the data, to make sure that there is that psychological safety built in so that people feel like they can actually share what's going on and share how they're feeling about things. And also just making sure that those processes are in place. And yeah, so that data is also something that we see with organizations that we work with, is oftentimes, when honest work is being done, or when the good work is being done, it feels like the data goes down before it has to go up. So you could see that, data going down as being something really bad, but it could also be telling you, that people are feeling, comfortable enough to be able to share how things are going.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I think that kind of like responses like this last question is like, what are we actually measuring, and how can we be sure that what we measure actually shows like the important things? And in line with that, I would like to ask you, like, how can we make, in this sense, like visible the invisible that we've been seeing like across this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Florencia. So that piece is actually one of the most important things that you need to start with, because you cannot be building that culture, good culture. You can't be going in blind. So you really need to have that data. And I think that question is really just, first of all, thinking about um, setting those systems in place. Now, cultures are built habit by habit, person by person. So the cultures that we create, the cultures that we see, is really just the sum of the day-to-day habits that people are practicing, what leaders are mirroring, what people are doing, and all of that is what leads to that culture. So you really want to be able to distill that and be able to make that into a tangible thing. And that is where you need to start when you're measuring, when you're trying to understand how things working. So the first thing you want to understand is really just that understanding how to get that data. But many times when people talk about data, and I can see some comments as well, people talking about, yeah, you're getting the data, but is it actually effective? And I think we all understand that tension. We've all seen that tension where it's like, yes, we need to have the data, but like, is it actually effective? Are we actually saying, is it actually helping us to understand what is happening? So more than actually gathering the data, you want to make sure that you are getting the good data, right? You're measuring what matters. So you're not measuring perception. So that's something to keep in mind. You have to make sure that what you're gathering is not just perception, it's not just your understanding, it's not just your biases, it's not just your passion. We want to have a good culture, your intentions. Everybody, most people have really good intentions. Most founders want to build that culture. So you're not trying to measure that intention. What you're measuring is actually what is going on. So what are the things that we need to measure? So the first thing you want to measure is how people are behaving. So that's the first thing that you want to understand, is the day-to-day behaviors. Like I said earlier, your culture is a sum of the behaviors, right? The day-to-day things, how people respond in meetings, how people are dealing with collaboration, how people are communicating, how they are dealing with feedback, how they are learning from things. So those are the kinds of habits that you want to make sure that you're measuring, and you use, things like your 360 feedback, your peer reviews, your decision logs, observing how people, behave in meetings and things like that. So you want to, distill that into the data of how people, how people are behaving on a day-to-day. The second thing you want to measure is how people are feeling. Now, this is definitely in order of priority, because the first thing you need to understand is how people are behaving, and then you need to understand how people are feeling. Of course, those things can happen simultaneously as well. But how people are feeling tells you how people are feeling about your culture. So I think this is the one that is probably more that many people tend to fall to, is, the engagement surveys, the anonymous feedback, the pulse surveys, the retrospectives, the exit interviews, right? Those things you want to make sure that you're capturing across the different parts of the organization. So how people are feeling. One very important part of how people are feeling that you need to measure is belonging and psychological safety. So not just necessarily the NPS surveys, how would you rate on a scale of, or would you recommend this place as a place for people to work, but how are people feeling in terms of psychological safety? Do they feel safe to challenge each other? Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they can bring their full self to work and not feel judged? So those are the things that you want to understand. And lastly, you want to measure how things are changing over time. What does that longitudinal data? So as you're gathering the behavioral data, you're gathering the psychological safety data, you want to make sure that you're also looking at how it's, how things are going over time. Because if you're making some changes, you're tweaking some things, you're experimenting and doing things, you can't really know what's working unless you can see, those trends. So the trend analysis, you want to be looking at your organizational, the feedback data, and things around all the quarterly analysis and the quarterly metrics. So gathering number 1 and number 2 will help you really see what's happening over time. Retention data, what does that tell you? And as you're gathering all of this, something to also keep in mind is the demographics as well is really important, because the demographics is also something that tells you who is being left out of the conversation, who is being left out, where there are biases in how people are showing up. So these are things to measure. And like we've said, but the thing about it is that for you to gather this data, you have to have the kind of culture that allows people to be able to share. And one of the things that we found really helps is just like giving that anonymity, at least at the start, when where people are still trying to get comfortable. Anonymity means anonymity, not anonymity to kind of get people to talk and then you're like, gotcha, I saw you said this thing. So you want to make sure that that anonymity, and that's why it's always good to have that external data coming in, so you're not just doing that with the in an informal way, but you're gathering it in a way that you have the surveys, you have the platforms, you have external consultants who are coming in and helping you set these things in place. So those are the things to look at. And like we talked about the psychological safety. So one of the things that we also need to consider is the feedback structure, right? So you need to have that psychological safety built in. You need to have the feedback infrastructure built in so that people are able to give that feedback on a regular basis, on a day-to-day basis. There's a culture of consistent feedback coming in, not just once a year, but consistently within the flow of work. And then you want to make sure that you're designing the culture so that you can have honest data really surface. So you can hear all of this and be like, okay, this sounds like a lot. But the good news is that small shifts move the whole system. So when you have that structure in place, even if you're just starting out and you're really designing these things intentionally, as you're beginning, you start to see things start to move, especially when the behavioral side of things starts to shift. And what we have found from the research, especially with our work with Honeycomb Works, and also doing external research as well, we're seeing that it only takes 25% of a group to change or to shift a culture norm. So when you have that 25% of the group mirroring the kind of behavior that you're looking for, it really, really has an impact. And particularly leadership is very important. So making sure that leaders, your managers are actually mirroring what you want to see within your culture. And if you're thinking about what can help you really come in to measure that, go outside of your I guess the informal structures that are happening, an unbiased way to do that is through a platform like Culture Plus. So Culture Plus helps you to get specific observable behaviors that define the culture that you're building. So the first thing you need to understand is like, okay, what culture am I trying to build? What do I want to see? You distill that into specific behaviors. And then secondly, the platform helps you to get feedback, to build that strong feedback culture and to gather that data. And lastly, you're gathering data on how people are behaving, you're gathering data on how people are feeling, and the platform also helps you gather data on how things are changing over time.
Thank you, Yin. I think, well, I'm having this takeaway of kind of like to saying that the 25% is just like enough like to start shifting things. I think usually we're saying that changing culture is almost impossible. It takes a lot of effort. And yes, it is a lot of effort, but it's like you have to kind of like make this 25% change and that's when you start. So thank you everyone for the three perspectives. I think as well that we have like a very good debate on the chat. But first of all, I just wanted to say that after like listening to the three of you, if the people that is watching, and it's kind of like dropping things in the chat, just wonder like where do they start? Um, Today, and as we mentioned also like in our comms, we have a culture checkup that's a survey that's not gonna take like more than 10 minutes, and it's gonna help you to kind of like understand where this culture that could be in your organization. If it is in the leadership aspect, if it is more like in culture, is more about like the processes and systems. So for this, and it's an invitation for you to download the like what is the name? Like capture the QR, like trying to take the QR um for getting like the culture checkup. I'm gonna also drop like the chat, like the link in the chat. For you to have it. Oh, or you can just do it. But yeah, but thank you so much for all of you. I just saying that I would like to have some minutes for the questions and for you to answer. I think that we have a very good one. I know that Rachel, you've been like very active on the chat, so maybe you can pull something that was happening here in the chat and you would like to talk about.
Sure. And just quickly on the tool for those of you who are down scanning it, it's just a quick survey with some questions to give you to questions to answer honestly about your organization and the way you work, and then based on those scores, gives you some recommendations that we've put together about like where we think that you have some strength, where we think you might have some areas to improve. And I think I think it's really useful. So Gary had said something about, can you fix the culture, or do you need to remove the people that are distrusted now at the top? And my short answer is it depends. But my more nuanced answer is that I think if the people at the top recognize that there is a problem and want to address the problem, then behaviors can be taught, new systems can be put in place, and I think that generally, I think that the key factor is whether or not the problem people recognize and want to change the problem. That's my thought.
Thank you, Rachel. James or Yin, does that have something to say about that as well?
I echo what Rachel has said. And I actually wanted to bring something up. I think that Gary had mentioned around the 25%. Yes, is great, but that's fine when there's like 25 people and they're all sitting in the same room. Absolutely. And I think that is the big challenge. So it's not, I think that concept is really trying to say a small minority can help to shift a norm. And actually, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's about being intentional. You have to find the people who are going to be the sponsors, who are going to be the ones who believe in whatever it is that you're trying to do, and getting them to really kind of do part of that work to ensure that those habits that we talked about, that Ian talked about, become the habit by habit, that becomes the behavior by behavior, that becomes the culture. So we do need that change. And there's a lot of work in psychology that shows that even in those really obscure situations, when we do see that difference and we can see the benefit of it, we can see the changes. So it might start off with like employee resource groups. It may start off with a particular type of department. It may start off with a particular country if you're a multinational, and those things need to come out. And of course, it's nuanced because there's differences between cultures and stuff like that. But I think the main point we're trying to make here is we have to start small. We can't start thinking absolutely everyone is going to change at the same time, but it's about being patient. And this is why actually we're really trying to home in on this point of the culture debt, because this is what happens at 5,000. You put in so much more work. Whereas if you start off early, and one of the points I made in the chat was it's iterative. You don't do it once, park it, and think that's it. It's about every time you're going to that next stage. So you've gone from 50 to 100. What do we need to get rid of? What do we need to add in? Okay, now we're going to 1,000. What do we need to look at now? What needs to what's now obsolete? What now needs to come in? And being intentional and evolving with it. So yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to add.
Thank you, James. I've seen that also. They're questioning sometimes, like they're questioning in the chat, like the anonymity and how this sometimes, like most of the times, is just like anonymity with quotation marks, and like it is not. And I know that James, you mentioned that Culture Plus that is like fully anonymous. But I would also kind of like maybe ask Oyin, like what we can say about like how do we safeguard like this anonymity, and how Culture Plus, for example, is a tool that actually safeguards this.
Yeah, thanks, Laurentia. I think the question on the anonymity is why it's very important to have an external resource that helps you to gather that data. Because if you're just gathering that data internally through maybe internal surveys that you created, it's quite easy to kind of tell when, especially if it's a small group, and you can tell people's words and nuances and things like that. So what the platform does is really to ensure that we're setting. So for example, with the 360 feedback, is making sure that there's a limit to how much feedback somebody's getting before that report is published. And then with the belonging survey particularly, there really is not linked to anybody's personal identity. And even when we do get, for example, the demographic data that tells you like, okay, this group of people said this. So for example, if maybe the survey is talking about, do you feel like you can bring your full self to work, or that, and let's say you have just one woman on your team and it's like, oh, 100% of women said they don't feel like, it's like, yeah, obviously you can tell. So we don't report that kind of data. We only report when it is safe to present that data. So I think what I would say to Gary is just look into any kind of external resource that would honestly help you to gather that data. so that people can feel safe to share how they're feeling, and you can really see how people are behaving.
Thank you, Ian. James, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add because it tags on to something that Bev was talking about, agreeing that yes, the psychological safety is paramount. And I know exactly what you mean about having been in those situations where, yeah, you're told all of that. And I think this is why it's really important when you do culture work is you do it properly. So once you've identified that, yes, we're in this position where people don't trust us when we say these things, this is where, people like the people on this call, platforms like Culture Plus come in handy because you're almost saying we're realizing, and I think part of it is, um, owning up as an organization, as the leadership, to say, yeah, we've done some things in ways that we probably shouldn't have, and we're trying to fix that. In order to do that, we all have to come together on this journey. We're bringing in these resources to make sure that everyone can feel they can actually contribute moving forward. So when you do it as band-aid things like, oh, we know everyone's not happy, so we're going to do this survey. Of course, no one's going to give you good information, but it takes a high level of vulnerability from the leadership, the founders, etc., to be there and basically say, yes, we realize that there've been mistakes, but now we need to do it. Because I agree with you, automatically you won't believe it once, because you're like, I've heard this a million times before and nothing changes. I give the same information, etc., etc. So that's the one thing I'd kind of like add on to that. And not to sound like a broken record, but again, this is why the earlier you do this, the better it is, because then you avoid these sort of things.
Yeah, and there is kind of like the last question that I think that we can address is like, what do you do if the organizations asks for a breakdown of the responses from your platform? They want to identify where the problem may exist from the responses that you provide, but they won't be able to if they cannot narrow down the data. Oh, Ian, I think you can answer that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, so we do provide like the data, because what the data we provide is for individuals. So when people receive, so there's that personal development side where a person is receiving peer feedback, and then they're able to get insights for themselves. And then there is the organizational data. Now with the organizational data, we do have very strict measures in place to ensure that what we're sharing does not cause harm. And so, with the example I gave the other time about the belonging survey data, so one of the things that we share is demographic data. So we don't report back to say here's a specific person's score or here's what a specific person said. What we report back is aggregate data and trends, and the way the data is presented is such a way that you can then identify. And because the questions and the things that are being, the framework is on specific observable things, so you can then distill down and say, okay, here is the area where we need to work on. So for example, managers, you can see where managers are scoring people higher on a particular behavior, or direct reports are scoring people lower. You can kind of tease out that what that means. So we have had situations like that where an organization has tried to get into like, oh, the very specifics of like what's, and we are very very firm about that privacy and making sure that we're protecting people, especially people from vulnerable groups. So that is something that we are is built, not just what we say, is also built into how the platform is framed or is built.
And
Thank you.
I'll just add to that quickly to say, having worked with Culture Plus in an organization, we did exactly what Oyin has said. And this is what we talk about with that longitudinal aspect of it. So we had one kind of survey tell us something, and then we knew what areas we needed to work on. We started working on those areas, and then we did another survey and another belonging survey, and we actually did see remarkably higher percentage increases in those scores. And again, you're seeing the trends. That's what's important. It's not that one-time snapshot. And again, because the work, we brought in the Honeycomb Works to do that. So people were able to give their owners data and feedback and things like that. So again, just to iterate on Oyin's point is it's iterative, and also it's you get the broad scope and then you do the work and you see what the impact is, and then that's how you move on. And you may focus on one or two of those behaviors, not everything that you get in one go.
Thank you, James. Well, thank you everyone for staying till this late. I know that we started later for the technical issues, and we really appreciate that you stayed till the end. And the conversation and discussion in the chat was great. So thank you for making this a very interesting conversation. Just to close, I would like to ask you, I would like to ask if each of the panelists, if you could say what is the most dangerous thing that a founder can say about the culture, what would you say? Yes,
For
Rachel, you can start.
for me, like when someone says, "I'll worry about that later."
Oh.
Yeah, we've learned that it's one of the biggest mistakes I hear. James, what would you say?
Mine would be, because I'm a process person, it's, oh, we know how we do things around here. And I'm like, I don't think you do. It's all in your head.
It's a, it's all in your head. I love that. Yeah, Nayin, yours.
It would be, we don't have a culture, we just have vibes.
Oh, that really
This
hurts
was
me,
an
you know, like
actual, this was a thing that an actual founder said. So, so we just
that
have good vibes.
the vice things, I just cannot bear it. I just cannot bear it. Well, thank you everyone. We're gonna well, this is recorded. We're gonna send you the recording for the ones which who can attend, and for the ones who couldn't. Thank you again for staying and for the tremendous conversation. And keep posted for more content from the collab. Here we're like Rachel from 66 Degrees of Strategy, James from Reworks, and Ayin and I from the Honeycomb Works. So thank you all and have a good rest of your evening. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Gonna stop recording.